Hi, my nieces and nephews and nibblings out there. It's your Auntie Elaine, and I'm here to tell you about late in life queers. You know, as one does. Now, before we get started, I do want to define a few things so we're all on the same page. Now, when I speak of late in life queers, I'm referring to people who came to realize they were queer when they were older, after they had already formed their adult identity. The limited research that there is clearly shows that most gay people realize that they are gay in their mid to late teens. And I'm not talking about that typical experience. I'm talking about those of us who, grew up and realized we were queer later. Another term that I found in my research that I think would be useful to discuss before getting into the rest of the meat of this video, as it were, is the concept of toxic monogamy. Toxic monogamy essentially is the idea there's only one way to have a healthy relationship, only one way to live your life, essentially, and part of the relationship escalator, which is, you start out dating, then you cohab, you get married, you have kids, you live that happily ever after. That's the assumption that society presses upon us. From the time that we are, born in this society, we are told that we are cisgender, that we are heterosexual, that we are allosexual, that we're alloromantic. And so, by that very fact, at some point, any queer person is going to have a time where they decide that that's wrong and something else is true for them. Like this one example that I found during my research of a pansexual woman who explained this exact phenomenon. She didn't, she was attracted to men, and so she was able to convince herself that the straight relationship escalator pipeline she was on was the right thing for her, until one day she was able to look back and say, hey, wait a minute, there's more to me than just that. And so people who are late in life queers may then experience the second term that I would like to discuss before we get started, which is second queer adolescence. A second queer adolescence is essentially a coming of age, again, with the new understanding that you're queer. Example would be when somebody who is gay has their first same-sex kiss, or when somebody who is demisexual feels sexual attraction for the first time, or when an aromantic person first establishes their own household that is theirs as opposed to one that they're part of that is someone else's, like when they're growing up with their parents. So because of the late understanding that we're queer, then late in life queers often have this second adolescence where we have to go through the developmental milestones of society again, or for the first time. So with all of that established, I kind of need to go back in time a little bit and tell you a little bit about what I was intending when I first started researching for this video. I started out wanting to tell the story of being a late in life queer with an emphasis on being a mythical late in life queer. Someone who is a micro label that doesn't exist as far as society is concerned. So I went into it thinking that the lesbian gay experience would be one thing, and then everyone else's experience would be something else. And I did find examples that kind of reaffirmed that initial assumption that I had. I saw stories about gay men who, talked about having double lives, or lesbians who were secretly in a relationship for decades before they include their friends and family in. That kind of coming out late in life is very different than what I experienced. Then I found this article, and this woman, a lesbian who did not come out until her 30s, had a passage that just really spoke to me. She spoke about how when she came to accept that she was a lesbian, she had a personal paradigm shift where everything in her life from before, she could look back at it now recontextualized and see this things in a new light, and things that didn't make much sense made a lot more sense in the concept and the context of knowing who she was. And boy, that was something that I could definitely relate to. When I was a kid, I had a lot of queer friends, and I also had a lot of friends who, like me, ended up being late in life queers. And so the roots of my queerness were there, but they were covered up in this topsoil of this toxic monogamy, the expected relationship escalator. It didn't take long after finding that article for me to find examples of other lesbians and gay men that experienced similar things. And that's when I realized that the real difference in experience was not gay and lesbian versus everyone else, but rather people who realized that they were queer when they were young, before they had formed an adult identity, and people who realized they were queer later in life, after they had already formed an adult identity, and they had to discard that identity and create a new self. And it definitely is a complicated process. The woman whose article kind of started me down this path, a lot of her experience didn't speak to me, because for a very long time she struggled with her identity. But for me, once I heard the term aromantic, it didn't really take that long for me to accept that I was aromantic, and thereby accept that I was queer. And so while that part of our experience is very different, we still had that common paradigm shift. And in that moment, when I realized that, it just underscored to me why it is so important for every queer person, whether they are lesbian, gay, bisexual, pansexual, omnisexual, whether they're transgender, bigender, agender, non-binary, intersex, aromantic, asexual, demisexual, pansexual, everything, everybody, all of us, we need to have solidarity, because there are commonalities in our experience that run across labels. And it's so important for us to understand that we have more in common than we have that sets us apart. And if we can band together, we can share resources. We can be part of lifting each other up, and instead of just thinking that we're too different and there's nothing in common there. So it was kind of eye-opening. I do think the biggest thing that I learned in my research about late in life queers was that representation is so important. For example, this anecdote that I found from a lesbian who said that she realized she was a lesbian after seeing Kate McKinnon and realizing that she was a lesbian, because Kate McKinnon didn't match her idea of what a lesbian was. And all of a sudden she realized that there's different ways that you can be a lesbian, and so maybe she's a lesbian too. It's so important. I found story after story where the key factor was hearing a term or seeing an example of a queer person who we could relate to. Now, a lot of us, when we were growing up, the labels that we use currently didn't exist back then, and so we wouldn't have been able to have representation. Obviously, this is something that's going to change with time and is changing significantly. Young people today are more likely to come out as queer as adolescents. There's a lot more representation, not just of gay people, but of all different kinds of queer people. Now that more of us are being able to hear these terms and find identities that we never knew existed but fit us to a T, we're be able to find communities and be able to find support. And that is, I think, at the end of the day, what's really important here. The support that we need to get through this second queer adolescence, this very disruptive part of our lives, we need communities to help us through that. I've had some really great experience with Facebook groups, especially a Facebook group that I have that's for asexual people over 30. It's really nice to be able to hear other people's experiences. Some of them are similar to mine, some of them are not, but we all have a lot in common. And one thing I did find was that there are some really great groups and resources for helping people get through this kind of rocky road, the second adolescence of life. So that's all I wanted to lecture about today, and I hope you learned a little bit something through this video, but hey, if you didn't, at least I did, so something good came from this, and I hope you have a wonderful day and are taking good care of yourself. Bye.